Hi there, everyone. So for this week's recordings, we're going to try to do a deep dive onto Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding. And for the first video, we're going to talk about basically the first 5 or so chapters. Now, this material is really important because it presents just really sophisticated version of empiricist arguments. Many people believe that David Hume was sort of like the most rigorous of all of the British empiricists, and so that's really why we're going to focus on him. He's also quite important because he ends up being a source of insight in some ways from the next philosopher that we're going to read after this, Immanuel Kant. And Kant is really one of the most important philosophers of all time. Definitely is up there like with, you know, Plato, Aristotle. Um, yeah, definitely on the short list, right? Um, so in any case, it's going to be really important because Kant is going to see himself as basically addressing the sort of skeptical problems that are elaborated by Hume, and perhaps elaborated by Hume in the most robust way in this book that we're going to read together, the inquiry. We're going to go through the whole thing. Similarly to how we did with the meditations, and some other texts like that. Okay, and so to begin with, Hume is writing this. This book was published in 1748. This is actually written in English, so we don't actually need a translation. And it was a very important book at the time. And so this sort of gives you, it's roughly 100 years after, Descartes published the Meditations, which was 1641. And so it's very much in response to a lot of the back and forth that we've really spent the entire semester reading about. And so Hume sort of embodies like one sort of response that you might have to all of the analysis that we've done so far for all of the early moderns. And now Hume opens the book with the distinction between practical and theoretical philosophy. And his way of characterizing this is like, okay, there's kind of like one species of philosophy that is aimed at uh, I'm looking for the exact word and I'm not quite finding it, but basically is aimed at sort of emancipating human beings, of making them feel uplifted, of guiding them towards virtuous actions, that sort of thing. And so the goal of practical philosophy on Hume's account is to terminate in specific actions, ultimately practical philosophy asks the question like, what should I do, right? However, theoretical philosophy, by contrast, tries to discover the principles that guide action. And so, ultimately any satisfying answer to any practical question about what should I do would take the form of a reason, right? It would be like, well, you should maybe in one case the conflict is like whether or not you should go to war or stay home and take care of your mother or something like this. This is a famous example given by Sartre sometime later. And so practical philosophy, you want to terminate in one specific option over the other, right? Like, do you go and do you help your mother, or do you go to war, right? And war against the Nazis in this case, if that helps at all. Um, and so ultimately, your decision to pick one over the other has to be a reason, right? It has to be like, well, I picked staying with my mother because I value family more than I value, um, this sort of nationalistic stuff about being able to beat the Nazis or whatever. Or I valued going to war because I thought it was more important for me to take a moral stand than for me to be there for my mother or whatever. And so what you can see in these cases is just that practical philosophy aims at arriving at a specific action. Theoretical philosophy aims at analyzing and discovering the principles that guide our action. And so while practical philosophy tries to terminate in specific actions, theoretical philosophy tries to get more and more general, more and more abstract principles, right? And so in this way, I think that we could pretty safely characterize basically all of the philosophy that we have done in this class, and basically that we will continue to do in this class, as theoretical philosophy, as trying to discover sort of like the most general and the most basic principles about maybe human knowledge or answers to metaphysical questions, right? In any case, we're trying to discover like really, really general principles. Now, Hume is interesting because basically what he argues is that, okay, what this points to is a sort of interrelation between practical and theoretical philosophy. On the one hand, practical philosophy does need theoretical guidance, right? Like the ability to arrive at a specific action, like you need to give good reasons for why you would pick one over the other, right? But these sort of abstract theoretical inquiries into the most general sort of principles guiding our knowledge, that sort of thing, right? The problem is that it becomes too disconnected and too abstracted from any sort of practical significance, right? And ultimately, this is part of Hume's explanation for why there hasn't been like any progress in the development of metaphysics, at least as he sees it, since Descartes. Namely because they are engaged in such high level of abstraction that it's no longer scientific, and not scientific in the sense of like the natural sciences, right? But scientific in the broader sense of even like having a method, right? One challenge that Hume sort of tries to pose to metaphysics is like, well, what sort of reason could we even give for or against, these sort of questions, right? How do we even begin to generate a response that we can legitimately think is tracking the truth, right? These are the sort of questions that Hume is going to bring up. And so this is a really profound rejection of one of the fields of inquiry that has really motivated us so far, which is metaphysics, which is the discovery of the most general fundamental principles of reality as a whole, right? For Hume, the domain of metaphysics is a domain of errors where you're basically so abstracted from any potential content or even any method of evaluation that you're, endlessly embattled in these pointless verbal disputes, right? And that's how I think a figure like David Hume would see a lot of what we've spent the semester so far studying, right? Like differences, say, between Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz over the definition of substance, right? From a Humean point of view, you would just want to ask, like, what is this really about anymore? What significance does it have for any sort of practical engagement with the world, and how does it actually relate to my experience? And in general, this is going to be like the real question that Hume's going to ask is, how does this philosophical analysis actually impact our experience? How does it affect how it is that we are supposed to live our lives, right? And so here I think is a cool quote from Hume that I think, really puts the point very well. He says, quote, "Here indeed lies the justest and most plausible objection against a considerable part of metaphysics, that they are not properly a science, but arise either through the fruitless efforts of human vanity which would penetrate into subjects utterly inaccessible to the understanding, or from the craft of popular superstitions, which, being unable to defend themselves on fair ground, raise these intermingling brambles to cover and protect their weaknesses. So, in other words, for Hume, metaphysics is a product of vanity on the one hand, because it's human beings' attempt to discover the nature of ultimate reality without really engaging in the prior inquiry of whether or not they could really ever do that. But on the other hand, it also reinforces the craft of popular superstitions, because it allows us to sort of hide our say our weakest beliefs, our most superstitious beliefs, in a highly abstract language and give it the veneer of scientific acceptability, right? And I mean, Hume in this work is not openly an atheist, because that's still not something that you could really do in 1748 or whatever. But I think that for most historians, he's regularly sort of seen as probably an atheist, right? And so I think that the idea that metaphysics hides simply the presuppositions of common sense that we can't really defend anymore. I mean, 3 examples of things that we've been examining all semester, more or less. God, right? God would be one of them. Freedom is another one. What is the nature of human freedom? And the soul, right? These are 3 things that I think it is fairly reasonable to suggest are human superstitions, right? And that metaphysics is, a way of defending these superstitions in a way that, is so inaccessible and so unbounded by method that they can never really be disproved, right? And so this is like a really interesting approach. It's very, very different. Very different than, say, Spinoza or Leibniz or something like that. Because for them, they wanted to take very seriously these questions about substance and, the ultimate nature of reality. Can we know it from first principles? What is the foundation, the most general basis, foundation, or principle of all of our knowledge, right? And Hume is explicitly rejecting this sort of approach. And so the modern tradition is really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you do have the rationalist tradition, you do have the Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz tradition of, really engaging in these hardcore metaphysical debates. But you also have figures like Hume, right, that are sort of undermining metaphysics at every turn, right? Or at least that's his stated goal. We'll see together if he's ultimately successful in that. And so, ultimately we get into all these pointless metaphysical disputes. That's really what happens in a lot of theoretical philosophy. It's too distanced from any sort of practical philosophy to ever be of any use. So what does Hume suggest? Hume says that we need to inquire into the limits of human understanding, right? One way of putting this is that a lot of the rationalists that we read sort of try to do things backwards, right? They try to imagine what our capabilities would be like if they were completely unlimited, right? Call that God, and then understand ourselves from the point of view that like God would have about us, right? And this is ultimately why, like, for Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, they're very likely to think about the human condition as finite, that we are limited in various ways, that we die, right? And the contrast case is to an infinite being, namely God, who does not experience, these negative things, right? And so for them, the task is to try to embody in the limited ways that we can, sort of like what God's perspective is like. And, you can imagine Hume's response based on what we said before, but that this is endlessly arrogant, right? That we can sort of like transpose ourselves into the perspective of God. Hume says if we want to make philosophy genuinely scientific, and by scientific here again, I don't mean like natural science, I mean like it has a method, right? It produces a kind of knowledge through a kind of method that is reliable, right? And so if we want philosophy to be a science in this way, then we have to inquire into the limits in nature of the human perspective, the human understanding, right? And understand it on its own basis before trying to abstract out, say, to the perspective of God and do all that kind of stuff. Okay, and so the way that this is why anthropology is very important for Hume, is because we're investigating like the human perspective, right? We're investigating human understanding, and his other, his biggest book is a treatise on human nature, right? And so that's also anthropological, right? And it's also epistemological because it's trying to engage in this question about what we can know before really trying to get into the metaphysical disputes that the other philosophers were engaged in, or ultimately rejecting them entirely, which is what Hume is going to do. Now, so for Hume, we have to start off with the idea that there are two kinds of representations. There are sensations and there are thoughts, right? And the core distinction between them is this, right? So on the one hand, I can actually look at this pen, right? And I form like a mental representation of it in my mind, like a picture, right? And when my eye is actually on it, then the clarity and distinctness and vivacity of this representation is striking, right? And on the other hand, I can sort of like close my eyes and I can try to imagine the pen as I had previously seen it. But the level of detail, the vivacity, the clearness and distinctness, right, of this representation is lower than when I actually do look at the thing, right? I have the capacity to be surprised by sensations. They carry more detail than I can really comprehend or recreate in terms of mental representation, right? And so ultimately, what Hume is saying here is that thoughts are sort of recreations of sensations that we have, right? And so and this is, the radical nature of Hume's empiricism is that all mental representation, all of basically the stuff of our mental lives comes from sensation, comes from our experience with the world. In thought, our ability to, through memory, to recreate objects, to imagine objects that we have not experienced, to create formalized systems, right, like mathematics or logic or something like that, that all ultimately is based in some way on sensation. That sensation is what makes it possible. That when thought just sort of like works on the raw materials that sensation gives us, and accordingly, in that way, is limited by sensation. And importantly, so, okay, here's an example, right? You might say something like, okay, but Penny, like the extent to which my thought can go is further than sensation, right? Doesn't that show that it's not limited by sensation? For example, I can imagine or visually represent in my mind like what a centaur looks like. And I could do that even if I had never experienced like a picture of a centaur, right? Like, half human, half horse. Like, even if I never saw, somebody artistically trying to represent a centaur, I could still imagine it by simply imagining, the bottom part of a horse and the top part of a person, right? Okay. Hume's response is, okay, yes, it is possible to take elements or parts of sensations and abstract them, right? So, like, in the case of the green pen that we were just looking at, like, I can focus on one of the properties of the pen, its greenness, rather than, the whole thing. And so that ability to abstract, I can then, imaginatively present something else under that color. So, for example, this is a blue pencil. I can sort of imaginatively recreate what the blue pencil would look like if it were the green of this pen, right? But Hume's point here still stands, which is that we might be able to relate sensations in ways that are different than what we actually experience, like when we imaginatively recreate them, or if we have a faulty memory, something to that effect, right? But that all of the materials of thought are ultimately given by, conditioned by sensation. Even the things that we can imagine are ultimately limited by the things that we actually sense. So Hume's sort of empiricist credo is going to be to always relate your thoughts back to their original sensation, right? And sometimes for more abstract entities, this is a little different. Like Hume gives the example of God, right? And, in his not posthumously published work, he's not openly an atheist or anything like that, right? And so he says, something to the effect of, like, okay, and to imagine God, you simply imagine your own finitude, right? You experience your own suffering, right? That sort of thing, and then you just abstract away the possibility of those shortcomings, and then that's what God looks like, right? But in any case, what Hume is just saying is just that any thought is simply a sensation that has a lesser degree of vividness, right? And so if we want to make everything a science, we have to trace all of our thoughts to their original sensations. Now, importantly, we can order our sensations in various ways, and they are ordered in various ways. So, the first way that sensations can be related is a resemblance relationship. So, right, I showed you this pen, it's green. If I showed you some other object, say our textbook, we can say that they kind of resemble each other, even though they're both, because they're both green, even though they're different shapes, even though they're not intrinsically related or anything like that, even though the shade isn't really right? Like, we still have the ability to compare them and say, oh, even though the textbook is more of a turquoise, it's still kind of green. And even though the pen is more of like a sort of like dark green, forest green, it's still kind of green, right? And so they resemble each other. And resemblance comes in degrees, right? Like if they perfectly represented the same shade of green, then they would have a perfect resemblance relationship, at least according to that quality, right? But things can be more or less resemblant of one another, right? And it's also possible for us to take up other properties, right? These two are sort of circular-ish, right, with a flat bottom, right? And that way they both resemble one another, even though they're not the same color, even though the shape is not exactly right, all that kind of thing. So one way that sensations are related to each other is they can resemble each other, right? And this is part of what lets us take out objects sort of like outside of the chain that we have them in our experience and compare them, right? Even if they're sensations that happened way far apart from one another in time, right? Resemblance relationships lets us go and compare any of our sensations for one or more properties that they have in common, right? Okay, so another relation that sensations can have with one another is that they are contiguous with one another. What does that mean? Hume's example is an apartment is like, an apartment complex, right? So like one apartment, right, is going to be next to another one, right? And so to imagine the apartment complex is then to imagine all of the parts, right? And how they are related to one another. And to even imagine one of those apartments in that complex, right, is to imagine it as part of a larger whole, right? And so contiguity refers to how sensations can be juxtaposed to one another in space and time, right? And ultimately, the apartments inside of the building don't actually have to resemble one another at all, right? They can be completely different from one another, except for the fact that they are juxtaposed, they're put next to one another in space and time. That's not a resemblance relationship, but it is a way in which those sensations are related, right? So that's another different kind of relationship that we think between sensations. Now, the final relation between sensations, the one that we're going to spend the most time investigating, is the relationship between cause and effect, right? Like fire produces smoke, for example, right? This is not a resemblance relationship. You're not saying that the smoke resembles the fire, right? And it's not a contiguous relationship, right? Things can cause other things that aren't close to them in space and time, right? Like the president of the United States, say, decides to drop a drone on civilians, that can cause that event to happen even though it's somewhere else entirely in the world, right? And so cause and effect relationships are not necessarily contiguous, right? And so they form a third independent kind of relationship, right? Cause and effect. And this is really what we're going to spend the remainder of this video thinking about. It's just what is cause and effect and how is cause and effect justified? Now, Hume is going to say most of our thinking about sensations is ruled by cause and effect relationships. And this makes a lot of sense, right? If they were ruled entirely by resemblance relationships, well, basically everything in some ways resembles something else, right? Yeah, you can take any two objects in the world and say that they resemble one another insofar as they're both in space and in time, right? And so resemblance is not really robust enough of a relationship to order sensations. Now, sensations are ordered contiguously, right? Like they occur not just contiguously, but continuously, in the sense that they occur in space and in time, right? And they always occur in space and in time, and it's in one direction, right? Yeah, okay, sensations are related this way. But presumably when we say that, that like we live in the same world, like we're not just saying that we both happen to experience stuff like together in space and time or juxtaposed to one another. We want to say that the world is ordered in a certain way that's similar for all of us, right? Like physics. Physics doesn't just say that objects are next to one another. They say that there's a causal force that motivates, say the movement of one billiard ball to the other, right? Okay, and so what Hume gets from this is like there's basically two kinds of truths. There's truths that are relations of ideas, and there are truths that are matters of fact. And this is going to lead to a philosophical problem called Hume's fork. And it's called a fork because like there's a little fork in the road here, right? This is a little sign letting you know. And you have to choose one option or the other, right? And so Hume is going to say there are relations of ideas, and this is like math, geometry, in general, any sort of formal system. So the kind of system that like we would set up, like computer science or formal logic, what we're describing in those systems is just how our ideas are related to each other, right? And so these are true independently of any facts about what's going on in the world, right? And so, in this way, Hume's distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact actually really closely resembles Leibniz's distinction between two different kinds of truths, right? Namely, analytic truths, truths that are, where the predicate is entirely contained in the subject, right? Versus truths about the empirical world that are contingent in the sense that they could be otherwise, right? And this is pretty much how Hume describes matters of fact too. Is that what describes matters of fact is that they are contingent, which means that that they could have been otherwise, right? So like if I say that gravity is a causal force that operates at such and such a magnitude on the surface of the earth or something like that, right? That number could be slightly different and it wouldn't be a logical contradiction in the sense of like 2 plus 2 equals 5 is, right? Now, what Hume is going to say is like, okay, these are what all of our ideas are, right? They're either relations of ideas or they're matters of fact, right? Now he's going to say our knowledge of cause and effect cannot be either of these things, right? Here's why. Our knowledge of cause and effect cannot be a relation of ideas. Number one, because it's never a contradiction to say the opposite of a causal relation. So like you could have fire, say, that doesn't cause smoke, right? That's not a contradiction in the sense that like 2 plus 2 equals 5 is. It's just something that doesn't make sense with the physical facts about our world, right? So it doesn't quite really fit what relations of ideas are. Also, when we're thinking about cause and effect, we're not talking about our ideas, right? We're not saying my idea of fire causes my idea of smoke or something like that, right? We're making objective claims about the way that the world really is, not ways about the world is as I see it, right? It's not according to my formal system or something like that, fire causes smoke. It's that I really believe that fire causes smoke, right? And so it can't be a relation of ideas. Another reason why it can't be a relation of ideas is because effects are not contained in their causes, right? So like causes and effects are two distinct phenomena, right? Otherwise, why would you need to link them through a causal relationship, right? And then accordingly, so what that means is that they're really distinct. That it's not like you could like reason about the cause of something and discover its effect, right? Hume says, I think very pointedly, that just thinking about the idea of fire does not produce the idea of smoke, right? What produces the idea of smoke is actually seeing a fire and registering that in your experience and then anticipating it in the future, right? And so what's going on is not a deduction of the effect, smoke, from the cause, fire. That doesn't make any sense, and it's not clear at all how you would do that, right? Like maybe Leibniz sort of like imagines God's perspective as so God knows all the physical facts about the universe and God knows all the physical laws, right? And so then God can sort of see how smoke is an effect of fire, right? Under the right circumstances, blah, blah, blah. But for us, we have no, we don't have the ability to begin with perfect knowledge of the laws of nature, right? Or perfect knowledge about the state of the universe, right? And so we have no ability whatsoever to simply, by means of intellection, arrive at what the effect is of a given cause. And so Hume says quite pointedly, well, okay, so, what that means is that causal relations simply cannot be relations of ideas. They cannot proceed in an a priori fashion, right? In the way of mathematics, geometry, and so on, right? And what this means too, he takes a quick swipe at all of the rationalists, is that it's completely pointless to talk about say like in the Cartesian argument, the source of your ideas, as if that's something that you could arrive at purely intellectually. For Hume, there's no point. That's simply a misunderstanding of the human condition. It's a misunderstanding of how causal relations work for us, right? And so it's a really pointless inquiry that can never do anything other than promote superstition, right? So causal relations, for these reasons, cannot be simply relations of our ideas, right? And what that means is that we cannot reason about cause and effect through purely a priori means. So what does that mean? Okay, our other option is matters of fact. And so here we also run into trouble, right? Because Hume says quite pointedly, and I believe that he is correct about this, is that our reasoning about matters of fact actually are informed by our belief in causal relations, right? So like one reaction that you might have to Hume is you're like, okay, Hume, I know that we're looking for the justification for our attribution of causal relations, right? And I know that it can't be this a priori stuff, like you're an empiricist, so you always say that that stuff is wrong. Okay, so, but I don't see the problem. Hasn't it simply been true that in the past, that the past has resembled the future, right? Like I wake up every morning and the sun rises, right? Isn't it correct for me to develop an expectation on that basis that the sun will rise tomorrow as well, right? And here's what Hume says. Hume says, you have provided only a circular answer, right? You have not really answered the question. The question is, how do we know that causal relations are real? In other words, what justifies my attribution of necessary relations between sensations, such that if there is smoke, there will be a fire, right? And if it's not a relation of ideas, then it can only be matters of facts, right? And so, but the way that I justify things is by saying that in the past, it has been this way, right? And so you're trying to say that the reason why the past will resemble the future is because the past has resembled the future, right? And so that's to beg the question. The question is, why am I justified in believing that the future now will resemble the past as it has been? And so to say that in the past, the future has resembled the past, that's to beg the question. That's just to say I've assumed this before, right? And it's sort of like worked out, right? But again, that is purely circular, right? Matters of fact, right? Whenever you're justifying something empirically, you're always saying in the past it's been this way, right? And so Hume is asking about the inference that you're making, that the future now will resemble the past as it has been, right? And rather than justify that inference, this response uses it, right? So that's a big problem. And so this is Hume's fork. The reason why it's a fork is because he wants to say, okay, how do you justify the claim the future will resemble the past, right? What sort of claim is this? If you say that it's a claim about the relationship between our ideas, then that's dissatisfying for the various reasons that I went over. But if you also say that it's justified as a matter of fact, that's also dissatisfying because that doesn't provide anything other than a circular explanation, right? Hume's saying, like, you see one event and then you see another event. You see smoke and then you see fire, but you never see the causal relation, right? You never see what about the fire causes the smoke and so on, right? You only see one event and then another event, right? There's a continuous conjunction of two events, right? And this is ultimately going to be Hume's account of causality. For Hume, these are the two only options for rationally explaining the nature of causal relations. But what his skeptical argument is ultimately that it's not going to be either of these things, and that the true answer is that it's all custom, which means that it's simply something culturally, something that it's simply a fact about human beings that we do expect the past to resemble the future, right? It's a fact, but it's a fact that is not justified. It's a fact that we can either justify by appealing to relations of ideas or to matters of fact, and those are the only two options that we have for rationally explaining things. So rather than doing that, what Hume is going to say is, ultimately, our attribution of causal relations is based on custom. That I simply in the past have seen it this way, and it's a fact about my constitution that I do expect it. But it's not rationally justified at all. Now, so this is a hard pill to swallow. That might kind of sound right in some ways, that like, it is true that maybe I don't have like a fundamentally rational explanation for why I expect the past to resemble, or why I expect the future to resemble the past. But it is a fact, right? And so Hume is just saying, like, look, don't get too worked up philosophically. Like, don't search for the true philosophical justification for our knowledge of cause and effect. Rather than sort of build up more and more complicated metaphysical systems to try to explain this stuff, right? Let's just admit that most of our causal judgments, in fact, none of them are really justified, right? It's a fact about me that I expect that the sun will rise tomorrow, but I don't have any direct insight into the basis for why this is the case, right? I never sense, right, the causal forces that make that happen. That can only be mysterious to me. And so I should accept the skeptical conclusion that it's just all based on custom and habits and cultural practices that we simply have come to, expect this stuff from causal relations. And the causal relations are really just a constant conjunction of two events. We see fire and then smoke, fire and then smoke, fire and then smoke, and then we come to expect that they're going to have this relationship, and then we just call that expectation that we have cause and effect, and that's it. I'm really interested to hear what you guys make of this. This is a really radical claim. Hume is undermining, most of the knowledge that we have. Arguably most disciplines in the hard and soft sciences are about causal relations, right? And Hume is just denying that they have any rational basis for any of those claims. You know, so like that's hard, right? But it's also very difficult to combat the argument that he's making here, right? And so I'm really interested to hear y'all's opinions. I hope this made sense to y'all, and I hope that you have a good week.